How's it going, everybody? I wanted to share some of my activities or my materials or some of the videos that I watch. I really wanted to share as much of that as I could. I've been trying to develop a pretty good English course for the argumentation section, or the argumentation course, or the argumentation class that you usually take in college. It's usually the second one. And so the activities or everything that I'm going to share is basically going to be based off of that concept. And the idea for me really was to create a classroom that cultivated critical thinking and prepared students for the idea of academic credibility, because I grew up not really understanding what that meant, or even critical thinking. And I know a lot of people, even ones who go to college, who are in the same boat. There are a lot of fabulous teachers out there, and they have a lot of great ideas. And the more and more I go to conferences, I'm seeing people talk about this more. And I think that's all really encouraging. So I thought I would kind of, throw my bit into all this. So I wanted to start this first video by sharing kind of the first activity that I do in this argumentation class, and I think it can really help kind of set a precedent for the rest of the class. I think it will help them complete future assignments, and really by the end what I'm hoping is that they have a pretty strong understanding of not just what academic credibility is, or what is or is not academically credible, but why those things are academically credible. So that's really what the point of this is. And so I'm going to share with you a list that I've made with my class. Basically, the activity is to just ask your class how they decide what's true and how they decide what's moral, and let the conversation develop. The morality question is usually, I think, a little bit more difficult for obvious reasons, but the truth one is very interesting, and I think it works really well. And so I've kind of created a list based off of these conversations, and I'm always changing this list. And I'm a layman philosopher, so I'm sure I've messed up a million things here, but it gives us kind of a guiding force. And because what I think a huge problem is with the idea of like fake news or everything that goes along with that, people really not being able to critically analyze arguments or sources. I feel like the problem is that we don't really have standards, and there aren't really consequences when we don't follow those standards that we don't have. It's like, so you have two people that have their different facts. Well, how do you go about deciding what a fact is? How do you go about deciding that the fact reasonably leads to a certain conclusion? Those are all conversations that I feel like should be had first. Another thing that I think you'll find about this list that I'm about to show is that it's intuitive. It builds nomos. It builds common ground in our. I heard the word nomos from one of my mentors or colleagues at the school, but it builds common ground for people. I think that's if we're going to talk about issues in communication, it seems evident to me that a big one is that we really haven't sat down and decided how we're going to discover what's true or not true as citizens. Experts do this. Philosophers have done this through time, which is another thing that you'll see of the list, which is really interesting, is that it's an intuitive conversation, and philosophers have actually already given the answers that students give without even knowing that, without even knowing that these are answers that have already been given by very smart people. Students do it on their own, and that's another very interesting thing. But what it does is it allows us to have something in front of us that we can kind of then take and look at sources and say, are these sources or are these people doing what we would expect them to do given the conversation we had on truth and morality? And I've gotten great results from that, which maybe I'll talk about in another video. But mostly nobody leaves the classroom feeling like the sources that they relied on before, where those sources weren't really adequate, nobody leaves the classroom feeling like those sources were still adequate. They recognize the faults in those sources that they used to trust in, and I think that's a really good. I think that's a good thing, and I think that we can go from there. There's more to do as long as we kind of keep following that trail. So I'm going to show this list now. Again, so some things you'll note, the philosophers are on here. These are kind of, the first one are two presuppositions that, again, very intuitive for students and everybody that I've talked to. By the way, I don't just build this list with students. I build it with people that I disagree with. And again, as these things are agreed upon, and it really makes it easier to have a conversation when we're actually looking at sources. Okay, is this source peer reviewed? So on and so forth. It becomes a pretty straightforward conversation. So, and then this third one, people tend to disagree with. I have a way I have an argument that people usually accept when I give it, that gets them to accept this, but that I think this one's going to be the most contentious. But that's not what we're here for. So really, the activity really is to just ask your class how do you decide what's true. And again, this is what we've come up with. So what usually happens though, or how this has gone for me, sometimes a student will come right out and say it. That happens. Sometimes that's the way the conversation goes, and that's great if it does. But sometimes they'll say something vague, and that's where I think you as the teacher, or us as teachers, that's where we need to start guiding the conversation, kind of getting more specific, because they'll say something like, well, I do research. Okay, well, what is research? Where do you get your research? How do you know that it's credible? You start to ask those questions, and then they start to kind of break down. They're not sure anymore. I don't mean break down emotionally, but they start to break down their knowledge. They get to kind of that Descartes ignorance, where you just get rid of all your knowledge, you jettison all your knowledge and start from the beginning. This is another thing that the activity can kind of do. But if they are having too much difficulty, you can give them an example, and that's what I do. So I'll say something like, well, imagine that the president was in the lobby right now of the school. How would you, if I made that claim that was true, how do you go about verifying that? And again, that's where they start to give those intuitive answers. I almost always get this, which is, I would observe it myself. I would look for it myself. I would go to the lobby myself, right? That's the first thing that they say that they would do, because we have that intuition that's kind of embedded in all of us as sensory beings, so to speak. So, but we talk about what the issues with that are. Obviously, there are issues. So sometimes, again, the student will be on top of it, and know what the issue is, but sometimes you have to prompt it. Sometimes I'll say something like, imagine that you're sleep deprived and you're hungry and you're dehydrated, and you come upon some mushrooms in the forest and you eat those, right? And you start seeing things, and you start seeing, obviously not to, or to be careful to tell them I don't advocate drug use, but you start seeing those things. You start seeing water sources, fairies, whatever. Do you assume that all those things are true now? And they're going to say no. Okay, well, that kind of contradicts what we were saying before in a way, because we said if you can observe it, right? And so, well, how do we get around that then? How do we get around that issue? And this, I usually don't have to prompt that much, but they start to say things like, well, I would go get a friend, or I would take a picture. And then you can, again, as the teacher, kind of prompt further, and okay, well, what would you do with the picture? And again, the very intuitive answer that they're going to give is, I would show it to other people. And so again, this idea of independent verification is very important. Independently, you want to make sure it's independently verifiable, and they see like, oh, that's the reason, for that. And some of these things I recall kind of learning in elementary school, or I'm sure lots of students have learned them in elementary school, but sometimes they've also forgotten. So if at this point you're saying, well, haven't they already learned some of this already when they were learning the scientific method? Well, first of all, not all schools teach that. And second of all, it's not in their heads anymore. It's been a while sometimes. So they're not, they need that refresher, because usually when I say independently verifiable, I get a pretty good amount of students who either don't know what that is or aren't clear about what it is. So going over it again can really be helpful. So, and then we have kind of the reverse of that issue, which is not only can you see things that aren't true, right? So you're going to see things that we're going to say, okay, we're going to disregard those observations. They're not going to fit in. You can also not see things that we're going to say are true, right? That happens too. We don't necessarily see Abraham Lincoln living, but we believe that Abraham Lincoln lived. We don't necessarily see the curvature of the earth, but we assume it's true. And how do we do that? And eventually they're gonna come up with some idea of, well, looking at other forms of evidence. And from there we have another issue. So, okay, we can look at another form of evidence. Well, let's say we look at, this is where I kind of use the white swan example. You look at 10 white swans. What do you assume about white swans? Well, all swans are white. What's the problem with that? Students usually know not all swans are white, right? Well, how do we get around that? Well, if we confer with other swan experts also making observations, we can include as much data as possible, because inferences aren't perfect, but they work best when you have all the information. That's the best you can kind of do in an inference, is try to gather as much data as possible and to gather a bunch of it. And so they see that, oh, well, you're saying that it has to be peer reviewed, right? It has to be. That's essentially what we're saying. We need other experts to also look at the conclusions you're making and check it or compare it to all the other data that's out there as well. And you kind of get a check system that's really important to building knowledge of this type. And so right there, they understand, okay, peer review is important for that reason. If we're not being biased when we say we're not going to take sources that aren't peer reviewed. It's for that reason. It's because you have to do it given how the mechanism works. And again, just in my class, and I've been doing this for a while, and I haven't done formal research on it, but I just, in my experience, see light bulbs go off. So, and then from there, I kind of we've also formed this in the kind of the form of a critical questions. I won't go through all of them for the sake of time, but you can kind of look at them because I'm not sure that rules are the best way to think about these as much as maybe critical questions. Again, this is a project in development. It's something that I hope will help me be a better teacher of critical thinking and finally get past this thing we call fake news, or at least to combat it in some way. But I do want to go down here really quick. Did you have the inference peer reviewed? Does the inference require the least amount of assumptions? But let's go back to the white swan just for a second. So we say all swans are white. We talk to experts in Australia. Oh, actually, they're saying that there are black swans there. They've seen about 20 or so. We've seen thousands of white swans. Is all swans are white correct? All students agree? No, it's not. Okay, what do we say then to make this correct? And that's where we introduce the idea of qualifiers, which is where I'll leave this now. But it's a very unique feature of academic writing that you're not going to find as much in popular writing, at least what's the word, on the whole, generally speaking, you're not going to find it. So, but it's something that you understand, oh, we need that to build knowledge, and we actually get to the point where we start asking questions like, when are we going to use certain qualifiers? Well, when our confidence is over 50%, things like that, I think really give us those standards to show students that we're not being biased when we talk about academic credibility, that it's things that have been thought of for thousands of years that are very intuitive to who we are as individuals even. It's not some brainwashing technique. It's something that they can build on their own, and they should build on their own. But we don't usually teach that. We don't teach self-built knowledge starting from scratch, and then even in the context, and what you can do actually before this is obviously have them write their own list before class and bring it, and then compare, and kind of go from there. But it's good to also show them we can build knowledge collectively. This isn't just about what you think the way to build knowledge is. We as a classroom are going to decide what standards we're going to create to fairly evaluate written prose. And so that's pretty much it. I hope that's useful in some way. I'm interested to hear feedback. I hope that I share this in the right places, but there's going to be a lot more videos essentially like this. I have more activities that are like this. Eventually, I'm going to go through the rest of the list. That's just what I've got for now, for the sake of time. I'm sure I'm already a little bit over what I want it to be. So anyway, if you have any feedback, it is much appreciated, and I would want to see what some of you are doing in classes. I've heard about it, but maybe it would be great to put some of this stuff on YouTube so it's available for other teachers trying to do these types of things.